Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. Red Bull have unveiled their 2026 car and the tongues have been set wagging. How much of what they showed us last night is actually going to arrive on the real car that we will see hit the track in the relatively near future? Some sources today are suggesting, despite all of the analysis on the developments that they showed us in this render reveal last night, that actually what they showed us are the ideas that got rejected from their final design. Certainly that is a possibility, that what we are seeing is simply to throw off the other teams from the scent of where Red Bull are really going with this year's developments, but plenty to get into. Very much on Twitter, your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. We're going to dive right into it at Red Bull, but really at Ford, because the first thing just to quickly say is that Logan Sargent will be a Ford racing driver in 2027, I think, when they're entering the Hypercar Championship. So that kind of came out of nowhere, but I'm not going to waste any more time before talking about this livery, because Red Bull and Racing Bulls revealed their cars in Detroit, Michigan last night. And this is what Red Bull came up with. We've been talking for some time that we were going to have the white outline again on the Red Bull. We're effectively going back 10 years here to what the Red Bull liveries used to look like when they were glossy rather than matte. And as far as I'm concerned, this looks absolutely spectacular. Now, it is worth noting, this picture you are seeing here is not the car that they had in person in front of them at the reveal. That was the F1 2026 very standard show car, but with the Red Bull livery on. Still looks spectacular. However, this version is clearly a developed version of the car. We can see multiple elements here that are substantially different from the show car. Now that is, first of all, surprising for Red Bull. Typically in recent years, all they've done is give us the standard show car with the new livery, which is often just the same as the old livery. But this year, they're taking a different approach. Is that because now Laura McKees is in charge, it's no longer Christian Horner, or are they still kind of doing the same thing? Because, like, these are brand new regs. It would be a bit of a surprise if they've given us some serious hints as to what they're doing, the first team to do so. The smart money seems to be that maybe part of what we are about to discuss is real, but certainly many parts of it will not be, and will be red herrings to the other teams. Now, I love the way the number 3 looks on this. I mean, it's number 3, of course, Verstappen's number now, kind of wild. Not number 33, not number 1. This back of the car looks stunning. I really like what Red Bull have done with the livery here. I think it's absolutely spectacular. The blue pops really nicely. The gloss is way better than the matte. And yeah, it's just nice to go back kind of 10 years. These are the renders of the RB22. This is the front view with very, well, interesting front wing design compared to what we see on the show car, and also just the amount of inwash of those end plates. We'll talk about it a little bit more in a second, whether that's actually real or not. But we're going back 10 years really to the eras such as in 2012, a pretty similar livery to we have seen back then. Not even dissimilar to like the original RB2 livery from way back in the day in like 2006. We're 20 years on now, but yeah, some comparisons to previous Red Bulls of eras past. Now, this is the Racing Bulls livery. I don't think it's quite as spectacular as last year. There's not quite as much white on it. It's basically the same. You will notice, though, looking at these cars side by side, there are a lot of differences. The clearest one to note, really, are these side pods. You see how low down these side pods are sitting on this V-carb here, or whatever they call it now, and then the top of the side pods is kind of left very much open. If you compare that to a similar angle of the Red Bull, I guess from this angle, the side pods of the Red Bull are very small. You can see there's still much more of an undercut on this Red Bull than there is on this Racing Bull version that has a bit of an undercut, but it's nowhere near the same as on that Red Bull render. I will say the wheel covers with the white, that looks real nice on these cars. So I like the opening liveries that Red Bull have come up with. There has been quite a lot of talk about Racing Bulls, that their intention this year is to come 6th in the championship. Their car is not especially aerodynamically advanced. Their main goal in the first few rounds is to bring developments that are going to bring the weights down. So there was a bit of talk about that today from the press. But really the main talk was about what's going on at Red Bull Racing. I will compare just some top shots here of the cars. You can see, yeah, the liveries are different, but there are some notable differences in the shape of the side pods, side by side. Certainly the engine cover as well is quite radically different at the back. You can even see from, like, you know, the suspension is somewhat different. The front wing is very notably different, and we'll get into why in a second. These very important elements of the cars on the leading edge of the floor, they're actually quite different on the V-carb. They've got these like connectors running to them, which they don't use on the Red Bull for now anyway. So look, It's very interesting to me that they showed us two actually different cars. They didn't just put the livery on a show car, they actually gave us some cars. And you can look at the back here, look at the different elements that they're using at the rear of the floor, top to bottom. Quite radically different ideas. This actually is that RB2, I think, that I mentioned earlier from 2006, when compared to the new Red Bull livery of today. There are certainly some similarities going on there. Now, the race put together some of the comparisons here, and of course there's been lots of analysis done by people far cleverer than myself when it comes to aerodynamics, so I'm not going to discuss that in detail. What I find more interesting is this actually real, right? Are we going to see this in Barcelona in a couple of weeks' time? Obviously, we might not see it anyway because it's not publicly broadcast. Is this going to be what they turn up with to Bahrain or to Melbourne or not? Is it purely a red herring to the other teams? So the official F1 render had this front floor element being very standardized, but in recent analysis, it became quite clear that this was potentially going to become a quite prevalent design. There's a way of having a try elements here. It may not be what the teams do, but there was a feeling that many of the teams would go in this direction. Now, whether they're going to go in exactly this direction, that's a good question, but that's what Red Bull are doing with that element of the car. This is actually the top-down view of the suspension. You can see as well, it's push rods, both front and rear, that we have seen on the Red Bull. We are expecting that from their final version as well, so I'm not sure, they could have set up the suspension in pull rod on the render and, tried to throw a bit of trickery in there. But I think everyone knows that they're probably going to go push rod this year. It's been talked about in the press for some time, so I don't think there'll be too much to be gained from that. But I just wonder how much are Red Bull playing the game, because historically they would be the team that always played the game, right? If they could throw anybody off the scent, if they could throw red herring out there, if they could show an idea that isn't actually real or not show anything at all, that's what they would be inclined to do. And as I say, with a brand new set of regulations, surely the incentive to do so is now greater than ever. This is another nice comparison between the front wings. Now, you'll notice, we'll see from a different angle in a second, the actuator of the front wing. This is not an element that we've talked about before because the front wings were static. But this year there's active aerodynamics. They will move from straight line mode to cornering mode, and they will do so through either a hydraulic or an electronic actuator. The hydraulic actuator can be smaller and presumably lighter and stronger for its, because it's using fluid. It can generate more force from a smaller unit, but the electronic actuators are quicker and maybe more precise. They have other advantages, but could well be heavier. So there's some debate on that, and we see a very different version that Racing Bulls are using from Red Bull. We'll see in a second, but these are just the end plates of the front wing, notably different in some of the decisions that they've made here, really, with this little element here, and what it means for the airflow is certainly above my pay grade. But this is what Rosario Giuliano was talking about, actually, when it comes to the front wing actuators. This is the Red Bull on the bonnet on the right-hand side. This small element here appears to be their actuator, or it's not their actuator, and actually they're not showing us what they're doing with that yet. That's what's a little confusing, because on the Racing Bull, we can see these two big elements here with, you can very clearly, where this arrow is, see the actuator that's connected to the flaps that will activate the active aerodynamics. That's what Racing Bulls have shown us. Of course, this doesn't look especially pretty aerodynamically, right, to have these big elements on here, and that's what they're going to go for, whereas the Red Bull front wing, as we can see a little bit earlier, has nothing like that on the front. You see absolutely none of those actuators. All you see is this little element in the middle, which is potentially a hydraulic actuator that's smaller and is hidden under this nose cone, but maybe not, who really knows? So that's what's a little confusing right now, is that it's clearly a very different approach that both teams are showing us at the front, and because they're all part of the same team, you would imagine that this has at least been coordinated to a certain extent. So Vanja puts out some analysis here. As I say, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but he's looking at a number of the elements of the Racing Bull, why he finds certain things interesting. If you guys want to pause, have a look at some of the analysis of these elements, feel free to do so. What I thought was interesting is that he did this for the Racing Bull, but then he looked to the Red Bull and said, as far as he believes, not much of this is actually real, and a lot of it is trying to throw the other teams off the scent. Whereas Racing Bulls, probably because things aren't quite as advanced, they're more happy to kind of show us within reason kind of what's going on, whereas Red Bull are less keen to do so. But yeah, these are some of the analysis on the Racing Bull for now. But then he puts this out on the Red Bull and says, I believe it's a complete mock-up and meant to wind up the competition. He talks about this primarily because of these ultra-wide side pods. He doesn't believe that these side pods can be real. With the because they are tiny, to be fair. Like, if you think about, you compare it to the previous one that we just saw on, I mean, even from this angle maybe, on the Racing Bull, you can see the side pods are very wide. They're also quite deep as well. I think there's a, this is a pretty reasonable angle to show. These are clearly bigger side pods than what the Red Bull apparently has on its version right here, where they're very slim, again, to contain all the cooling elements. You've got a massive, bigger electrical motor now. How's it all going to work? From a packaging perspective, clearly this render has no engine in because it's a render, and the real car doesn't have an engine in yet either. So what the packaging looks like from a cooling perspective, we don't really know. But he believes this is probably too far. He thinks they're taking the other teams for a ride here, and they're showing an incredibly small side pod with still a major undercut. Look, maybe it's possible. Mercedes turned up in 2022 with a side pod smaller than this, right? The zero pod concept. It was obviously a different design. It was effectively a vertical side pod rather than what we see here. But maybe for the first year of the regulations, that's a bit of a stretch. So he believes anyway, comparing it to the V-carb, this is too much and is not going to fly. And look, this front version, we'll see about that. And then, of course, on the fronts, what do we have, right? Is it, are we going to get actuators here? Can you just use the brackets there to make it happen? It's a little bit unclear. Now, of course, there's been some great analysis done on what we've seen on the Red Bull B Sports car engineers, like watching their content. Not a criticism of their content at all. I'll keep watching, I'll keep hitting the like button. But what is interesting is whether what they're talking about is actually going to end up being real when we see the real cars. So Dr. Obbs, well connected at Red Bull Racing, knows a lot of the guys over there. He says that this is unlikely to be the real version. I do know that some cheeky aero bits will be put into these renders to get people talking. It is done on purpose to generate some buzz. They are usually ideas that didn't make it into the final design, which I thought was kind of interesting, right? The idea that some of these interesting elements here are probably ideas that the team played around with but decided not to go with. So they already designed those ideas, so it's ready to go, but they decided that they weren't going to make the final design, so they put them in the render to throw other teams off guard and obviously to keep us on our toes as fans. Of course, there may well be some things in there that are real. Things are going to change radically over time as well, right? What we see today will be different to what we see in Barcelona, Bahrain 1, Bahrain 2, Melbourne. More than likely there will be some substantial changes. But the idea is, what's the development route? What's the concept looking like? It's exciting we at least have some car which has been developed by engineers rather than just the base F1 mock-up that we have seen so far. So he also goes on to say sometimes they throw something out there to get their competitors studying a rabbit trail that doesn't work. More of a distraction ploy. I've heard that directly from a Team Aero before. So pretty fascinating, I think. Intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below on whether Red Bull are playing this type of game. What we do know is that Max Verstappen was asked about a couple of things. He was actually queried on whether GP was always going to stay. There were some questions about that over Christmas. Max says there was no doubt about that. He was always going to stay at the team. The other key development at Red Bull was actually about their engine. So the engine is going to be called the DM01 after Dietrich Mateschitz. McKees talks about it a little bit. He was not scared by the scale of the challenge. We have the opportunity to make him proud. But he does go on to say, Laura McKees, that you've got to bear with us the first few months. The expectations are not radically high. He said it would be naive of them to expect that their engine would be as strong as engine manufacturers who have been doing it for a century. So look, you've got to understand that point. But also, it's not just McKees talking. And while McKees is being, I wouldn't say pessimistic, he's trying to be more of a realist maybe in the situation. Red Bull still are quite all guns blazing in their talk, especially on their engine. And look, I think if Red Bull knew they were in a bad spot, they wouldn't be talking in the way that they are. McKees is always, he's good at managing these expectations, but their top power unit guy has been running his mouth. Now, the other day, we heard that Mercedes might be the only team to have this compression ratio trick, and that Red Bull didn't actually have it. Auto Race has said that as far as they were aware, it was only Mercedes using this to gain an advantage. Now, Ben Hodgkinson, Red Bull Powertrain's technical director, he doesn't directly say that they have it, but he certainly hinted at it. I know what we are doing. I am confident that what we are doing is legal. Of course, we have taken it right to the very limit of what the regulations allow. And yeah, that's pretty much what he said. So this is very interesting because is he talking about the compression ratio? Because if he is, and it certainly sounds like he is, then it looks like Red Bull might well have it as well. I think he also mentioned effectively that, look, teams are going to target 15.999 as their compression ratio when it's static, but beyond that, they will be trying to go above it. But for the top guy of Red Bull Powertrains to say, yeah, we're absolutely pushing the limits here, makes it sound like he's at least pretty confident they're going to be in a reasonable spot competition-wise. He also said this, which I thought was kind of spicy. Nobody knows for sure where the teams are going to be. I think the first stories that Mercedes has the best engine came from Mercedes themselves, and that was precisely when they wanted to sign the best driver, which is kind of funny, right? The implication that Toto was sending out these stories behind the scenes about Mercedes engine so that they could go and attract Max. But look, that was probably never going to happen in 2026, but time will tell if that could still happen at some point. I've been in this business for so long and I've learned that it's best to ignore all the noise. I have confidence in my team, in Red Bull, and in the facilities that they have made available. But still, Red Bull are talking, at least with Hodgkinson, quite a big game. But Helmut Marko, former Red Bull man, he says Mercedes seem to be the furthest along in engine development. I fear that the world champion will be a driver using a Mercedes engine because, of course, Marko really wants Max to win again. I don't know if Marko does care about Red Bull, obviously, the Dietrich Mateschitz connection and all that. Yeah, he's been fired from the team. I still think Marko would want Max and Red Bull to win. But as he says, I fear that it's going to be a Mercedes driver that does it. Now, a driver that with a Mercedes engine at least. So you would think Mercedes or McLaren, the most probable. But then he says Williams is reportedly making quite a bit of progress. So again, one of the more exciting teams for next season for sure is Williams, where they're going to slot in. If Mercedes do have the best engine, you know, can Williams be third? Can they be better than that? Who knows? Maybe it's not entirely impossible. They have put a lot into making this season work. Very excited to see what Williams have come up with for the new year, especially given there is not much doubt about their engine. The other benefit for Max Verstappen, and this is actually a remarkable story, I thought. We did talk about this in recent months, that Matt Corler, who was the top mechanic, Max's first mechanic, he was leaving to go to Audi, and the feeling was, oh, it's another name, another face that Max is having leave his team with all the other guys that have departed in recent years. But nothing to worry about Max, because the replacement as Max's first mechanic is John Corler, who is the twin brother of Matt Corler, who's just moved to Audi. So, I mean, yeah, look at this picture. It's pretty fascinating. I wasn't aware that there were twin brothers as Red Bull mechanics. But, yeah, so at least Max doesn't have to get used to a new face. Of course, they'll be somewhat different in terms of character, but fundamentally it's the same guy, right? So I thought that was pretty remarkable. At least that'll keep Max happy to some extent. Just a little bit of talk about the other teams before we close out the video. Reportedly, Ferrari are firing up their power unit today for the first time. We may hear rumours later tonight, and we'll talk about them tomorrow if so, on how that went, if any way at all. Apparently, the livery will feature what is described by De Kessa as a pleasant surprise. Now, what does that mean, right? What's a pleasant surprise? Because it's going to be red, we know that for sure. Is it Ferrari on the rear wing? Is it the HP logo isn't in blue? I don't know. Something like that I would expect. There's also been some talk that Ferrari are downplaying their preparation, or they're certainly not being as gung-ho as normal. Apparently that's on Fred Vasseur's instructions. They are deliberately pursuing a strategy of staying out of the spotlight throughout the entire pre-season. Is that going to be critical to their success? I don't know. I kind of miss the days where Ferrari would come out and the SF23 was unprecedented in terms of speed. Doesn't seem like we're getting that this year anyway. But intrigued to your thoughts as ever on all of this stuff in the comment section below. They did show us but a glimpse of their Red Bull Ford powertrain's engine, but again, that's not going to be the real thing. But I think it was certainly a better reveal than Red Bull normally do, let's be honest. And they've given us a lot to think and to talk about, and it's not going to be that long from today until we start to see some of the other cars as well. We'll see if the other cars just give us straight up renders or like liveries on top of the show car, or whether we get proper Red Bull renders as we have seen today. This is Mercedes race suit with that Petronas green going on, and well, we'll see their car in the near future too. So very much interested to your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.